invasive species in the Florida Everglades is threatening the area's sprawling ecosystem. Burmese pythons are apex predators at the top of the food chain.
In 2024, biologists dissecting a Burmese python in the Everglades found something they never expected. The snake's organs were disintegrating from the inside out, with no signs of injury or disease.
Scientists from the Conservancy of Southwest Florida sharing video and photos from when they came up on a 15-foot Burmese python eating a full-size white-tailed deer.
It was the first proof that Florida's secret biological weapon, quietly released into the wild, was working. But here's the twist. Not all the pythons were dying. In fact, some were adapting. What happened next would shake the scientific world. To understand how we got here, we need to rewind the clock. The takeover. It all started with curiosity. The Burmese python, with its exotic scales and calm nature, became a favorite among reptile enthusiasts. But what most owners didn't realize was that their cute little pet could grow into a 16-foot predator weighing over 200 pounds. When that happened, many made a dangerous choice. They released them into the wild. Then came Hurricane Andrew in 1992. The storm tore through Florida, flattening homes, ripping open breeding facilities, and setting even more snakes free. What followed wasn't an accident. It was an ecological chain reaction. Florida's warm, swampy wetlands were almost identical to the python's native jungles in Southeast Asia, the perfect new home. Without natural predators, the snakes multiplied fast. A single female could lay dozens of eggs at once, and before long, the Everglades were crawling with them. Scientists now estimate there are anywhere between tens of thousands and over 300,000 pythons in the wild, an invasion that has changed the region's entire food web. Field studies have revealed stomach contents filled with everything from rabbits and raccoons to birds and even alligators. In some areas, populations of small mammals have dropped by more than 90%. It's as if the swamp's original residents are vanishing, one by one, swallowed by an intruder that was never meant to be there. What began as a few abandoned pets has grown into one of the worst wildlife disasters in Florida's history. And every solution they tried only made the problem worse. Florida's python disaster. Most people picture the Florida Everglades as a wild paradise. Alligators basking in the sun, herons gliding across the water, and deer vanishing into the tall sawgrass. For centuries, it's been one of the world's most fragile but perfectly balanced ecosystems. But over the last few decades, something slipped in that didn't belong. And it didn't just settle, it took over. The intruder was the Burmese python. Brought in through the exotic pet trade, they found their way into Florida's wilderness. Some escaped when hurricanes destroyed animal facilities. Others were dumped by owners who realized a 20-foot predator wasn't exactly a house pet. Once free, the snakes discovered paradise. The Everglades offered everything they needed: warm weather, endless wetlands, and an all-you-can-eat buffet of native wildlife. Back home in Southeast Asia, predators kept them under control. But here, there was nothing to stop them. A single female can lay around 100 eggs in one go, and soon, the Everglades were crawling with tens of thousands. At first, no one noticed. Then, the signs became impossible to ignore. Rabbits vanished. Raccoons and opossums dropped by more than 90%. Even alligators, the swamp's apex predators, were found inside python stomachs. The balance that had held the Everglades together for thousands of years began to unravel. Scientists, hunters, and officials launched every possible counterattack, but the snakes just kept spreading. No one expected how quickly a few pets could turn into one of Florida's greatest environmental disasters. Failed attempts to control them. Once Florida realized how serious the python invasion had become, the state scrambled to fight back. But hunting down giant snakes in a swamp the size of a small country was never going to be easy. Officials, hunters, and scientists tried every method they could think of. Yet one fact became impossible to ignore. The snakes were winning. Professional hunters were called in, people who had wrestled massive reptiles before. Some came from local communities, others from wildlife organizations. They drove along levee roads at night with spotlights, scanning the grass for movement. The snakes they caught were enormous, often stretching over 18 feet and weighing well above 100 pounds. But for every python captured, dozens more remained hidden. Their breeding rate was staggering, easily undoing months of progress. So Florida decided to add incentives. Bounty programs paid hunters for every snake captured, turning the hunt into a paying job. The plan drew attention and briefly boosted results. Hunters showed off record-breaking catches, and photos of massive pythons made national headlines. But the overall impact was minimal. The Everglades' vast maze of vegetation and waterways made the search feel endless. In 2013, the state launched the Python Challenge, a public hunting contest open to anyone willing to take the risk. Hundreds joined in, and media crews followed their every move. After weeks of effort, only a few hundred snakes were removed. Experts warned that tens of thousands, maybe even hundreds of thousands, still roamed free. Even high-tech methods struggled. Teams began using Judas snakes, captured pythons fitted with trackers, and released in hopes they would lead hunters to others. The strategy worked in isolated cases, but made no real dent in the growing population. The deeper problem was simple. The pythons had no natural predators in Florida. In their native Southeast Asia, tigers, leopards, and large crocodiles occasionally prey on them. In the Everglades, they faced none. Instead, they became the top predator, swallowing everything from rabbits and raccoons to wading birds and even alligators. Each failed attempt only deepened the frustration. Scientists warned that entire species of small mammals were vanishing from large parts of the Everglades. Hunters admitted that the snakes were spreading faster than anyone could capture them. Officials faced growing pressure from the public to act. Florida had thrown everything it could at the invasion, yet the pythons continued to multiply. The conclusion was grim. Traditional methods were not enough. If the state wanted to save the Everglades, it needed a new kind of weapon, one born not from brute force, but from science. The radical new idea. For a long while, Florida tried the usual methods to deal with its Burmese python problem. Hunters were hired, bounties were offered, traps were set, and even high-tech tracking devices were used. Yet the snakes kept multiplying. By the early 2000s, it was clear that simply catching them one by one would never be enough. The snakes were too good at hiding, reproducing, and surviving in the wild. That was when some scientists decided to explore something far more daring and controversial. The idea was simple on paper, but groundbreaking in practice. It was a biological weapon designed specifically for pythons. Instead of chasing them with traps and guns, researchers thought, what if the snakes could be killed from the inside? This meant looking at the world of viruses, bacteria, and parasites, the invisible organisms that can make an animal sick or even kill it. Scientists began studying whether they could find, or even engineer, something that would only target Burmese pythons while leaving every other animal in the Everglades untouched. That was the key. The last thing anyone wanted was to release something that could harm native species such as alligators, panthers, or harmless snakes. It was not a decision taken lightly. Releasing a biological control agent is one of the riskiest steps in wildlife management. History is full of examples where things went wrong. For instance, in Australia, rabbits became such a massive pest that scientists introduced a virus called myxomatosis to control them. It worked, but it also caused years of suffering, and pushed the ecosystem in unpredictable directions. No one wanted a repeat of that in Florida. Still, the scale of the python invasion made researchers push forward with caution. A female python can lay more than 50 eggs at a time, and their population was spreading faster than traditional control methods could keep up. If nothing bold was tried, the snakes could permanently change Florida's ecosystem. One proposal involved a virus-like agent that would spread only among pythons, weakening or killing them but sparing other animals. Another explored genetic techniques, where the snake's own DNA could be targeted to interfere with reproduction. Imagine a scenario where a python could live but never successfully breed. That would stop the invasion over time without filling the Everglades with corpses. The idea sounded almost like science fiction, and in many ways it was. But for the scientists facing a crisis with no end in sight, it felt like the only way forward. Of course, it came with huge risks. What if the biological weapon mutated? What if it jumped to another species? Those questions made the research slow, careful, and filled with debate. This radical new idea showed just how desperate the fight had become. Traditional tools were failing, and the war on pythons was about to cross into the invisible battlefield of biology. The release into the wild. For years, Florida had been losing the battle against Burmese pythons. Traps, hunting programs, and bounties did little to stop them. The snakes kept multiplying, devouring native wildlife and reshaping the ecosystem. It felt like a war no one could win. That was when researchers decided to try something different, something bold, and a little risky. The decision split the scientific community. Some argued it was Florida's last hope. Others called it ecological Russian roulette. In the end, desperation won. In 2024, Florida approved the release. It was not another bounty hunt or mass capture campaign. This time, the state turned to science. The new plan involved a biological agent, a modified organism designed to target python reproduction from the inside out. It was engineered to disrupt specific proteins in python blood, weakening the snakes over time and preventing them from breeding successfully. Officials moved forward carefully. They selected remote areas of the Everglades, far from public access, to begin the controlled release. Researchers tagged and tracked dozens of pythons, collecting samples to study how the new method spread and whether it affected anything else in the environment. Public announcements were minimal. Authorities feared panic and backlash if the experiment failed, and they wanted evidence before facing questions. Within the Everglades, the operation unfolded quietly, under the dense cover of mangroves and swampland. At first, the results seemed promising. Several captured snakes showed unusual symptoms: sluggish movement, low reproductive activity, and weakened muscle tone. For a moment, it looked like Florida might finally be turning the tide. But the excitement soon gave way to anxiety. The Everglades is one of the most delicate ecosystems in North America. If the modified agent mutated or spread to other reptiles, it could threaten everything from alligators to endangered turtles. The same thing that made the plan so daring also made it dangerous. Still, Florida pressed on. The python crisis had gone too far to back down. Each year that passed meant fewer birds, fewer mammals, and more destruction. The release of this new biological weapon was a gamble, one the state was willing to take. And so, deep in the swamps of the Everglades, the experiment began. Few outside the project knew what had really been unleashed. For the first time, Florida was not hunting the pythons from the outside. It was attacking them from within. The first sign of success. At first, the results looked promising. Not long after the release began, field researchers started noticing odd behavior among the Burmese pythons in the Everglades. Snakes that once moved with silent confidence were suddenly sluggish. Some were seen swimming awkwardly, almost as if their bodies were not responding the way they should. Others appeared weaker, their usual power to constrict prey visibly reduced. When a few specimens were captured and examined more closely, the evidence was even more striking. Inside their bodies, scientists found damage that could not be explained by injury or disease. The tissues showed clear signs that the new weapon was taking effect. It was as if something inside the snakes was attacking them from within, disrupting the very systems that made them such unstoppable predators. For biologists who had spent years watching pythons thrive unchecked, this was a turning point. For the first time, they saw signs that the invaders were not invincible after all. Each captured specimen with internal damage gave them more confidence that the strategy might actually work. Officials monitoring the situation grew cautiously optimistic. After decades of failed hunts and costly bounty programs, maybe Florida had finally cracked the code. The hope spread quickly among those working on the project. If this method could continue to show results, it might tip the balance in Florida's favor. Entire populations of native animals, from rabbits to raccoons to even young deer, could be spared. Still, the scientists knew better than to celebrate too soon. The Everglades is a complex environment, and results in the short term do not always hold up over time. They needed to keep monitoring to make sure the symptoms were consistent and that the damage they observed really was leading to a decline in the python population. Yet the mood among the teams was different now. There was hope in the air, a sense that maybe the tide was finally turning. After years of frustration, the Everglades seemed to whisper a different story. The hunters of the swamp were starting to stumble, and the people who had fought them for so long were finally daring to believe that victory was within reach. But then, something strange happened. Just when it looked like Florida had finally found the answer to its python problem, something unexpected began to happen. The early results had given everyone hope. Sick and sluggish snakes were proof the new method could work. But as more time passed, researchers started noticing something that did not fit the story they wanted to tell. Not all the pythons were dying. In fact, some of them seemed to be responding in ways nobody had predicted. Instead of collapsing, certain snakes appeared to fight back. Their immune systems kicked into overdrive, producing stronger defenses than scientists had ever seen in this species before. When examined, these pythons showed signs that their bodies were trying to repair the very damage the weapon had caused. What had begun as a lethal internal assault was now turning into a biological arms race, with the snakes adapting to survive. Field researchers also noticed shifts in behavior. Healthy pythons had always been bold hunters, gliding through the swamps with ease. But the ones exposed to the new method started acting differently. Some became more cautious, spending longer periods hidden in dense cover or deeper waters where they were harder to track. Others showed bursts of aggression, striking more often when approached. This unpredictability made capturing and studying them far more difficult. What unsettled the scientists most was that these changes suggested something bigger than a temporary reaction. Nature, after all, is built on survival. When one species is threatened, evolution often speeds up, favoring individuals with traits that give them even the slightest advantage. In this case, the Burmese python's sheer numbers and rapid breeding meant that any resistance, however small, could spread through the population with alarming speed. This raised an uncomfortable possibility. Instead of wiping out the python invasion, Florida might have triggered an unintended adaptation, giving the snakes tools to endure even harsher conditions. If the weapon was making some of them stronger, the ecological crisis could become even worse. The very solution that promised relief might actually fuel the problem. The mood among officials began to shift from cautious optimism to deep unease. Biologists who had once spoken of progress were now warning of unpredictable outcomes. The weapon, once seen as a silver bullet, was starting to look more like a gamble with unknown stakes. Could it still succeed in weakening the overall population? Or had the Everglades just become the testing ground for a tougher, smarter version of an already unstoppable predator? For the people working on the front lines, the change was disheartening. Years of effort had built up to this moment, only for nature to remind them how unpredictable it could be. The python was no ordinary invasive species. It was a survivor, capable of adapting quickly to almost any challenge. And if these early signs were correct, the story of Florida's fight was far from over. The scientists realized they were not just battling a snake, they were battling evolution itself, and evolution had just made its first countermove. Ripple effects on the ecosystem. Within months, biologists working deep in the Everglades began noticing strange patterns. Small mammals like raccoons and opossums were turning up sick, confused, and weak. At first, it seemed like a coincidence. Then, the reports grew. More animals, same symptoms. Something in the swamp was spreading, and no one could explain how. Next came the birds. Species that usually thrived in the wetlands, from herons to ibises, started behaving oddly. Some lost their strength mid-flight, others were found dead near the water's edge. Reptiles soon followed. Turtles, lizards, and even smaller snakes were being discovered in alarming condition. What had started as a targeted strike against Burmese pythons was beginning to ripple across the food chain. By the time researchers realized the scale of it, the swamp itself felt different. Even apex predators were not untouched. A few alligators, once symbols of the Everglades' resilience, were found lethargic and thin. Something unseen was moving through the ecosystem, affecting life at every level. Locals began to sense it too. Fishermen noticed quiet patches in areas that once teemed with life. The water felt empty, the air still. Some spoke of catching fish that looked strange, sluggish, and pale. Hikers and tour guides mentioned the silence, the kind that didn't feel peaceful, but hollow. These stories were brushed off at first, but the pattern became too consistent to ignore. Scientists scrambled to keep up. They ran tests on sick animals, collected soil and water samples, and analyzed tissue for any trace of the new weapon. What they found was troubling. The method designed to weaken pythons seemed to be touching more than just its intended target. It was leaving fingerprints across the entire wetland. The discovery sent a wave of unease through the research teams. The Everglades was never built to handle something like this. Every creature, every plant, depended on another in ways too complex to control. A single disruption could ripple outward until the whole system began to crack. For Floridians, the Everglades was more than a landscape. It was heritage, a living memory of what the state once was. The idea that their fight against the python crisis might have created a deeper wound struck hard. What began as a bold step forward was starting to look like a quiet disaster unfolding beneath the surface. And as the scientists watched the data come in, one question refused to fade. Had Florida really solved its problem, or had it simply changed its shape? Somewhere in the swamp, life was still moving, adapting, and spreading. But whether it was healing or breaking, no one could yet tell. Public backlash and fear. When word got out that the Everglades experiment was affecting more than just Burmese pythons, the reaction was immediate. By midweek, local stations like WPLG Local 10 and Wink News were running footage of sick raccoons and dead turtles pulled from the wetlands. The Miami Herald published an investigative piece titled Python Cure or Ecological Gamble, and by the weekend, national outlets like National Geographic and NBC News had joined the coverage. What began as a quiet scientific breakthrough had suddenly turned into a national debate. Some praised the effort, saying Florida finally had the courage to fight back after decades of frustration, but others saw danger in it. Environmentalists warned that the state was walking a thin line, calling the experiment ecological Russian roulette. To them, This was not just about pythons. It was about humanity's history of trying to control nature and losing control instead. They brought up the infamous cane toad disaster in Australia, where toads released to stop beetles had turned into an unstoppable plague of their own. The parallel was too close for comfort. The backlash quickly moved from television screens to town halls. In Homestead, a heated community meeting saw locals demanding to know what had been released into the swamp. One fisherman shouted that the government had turned the Everglades into a test lab. Another woman asked if the chemical could end up in her drinking water. Officials tried to calm the crowd, but their vague answers only made things worse. People wanted facts, not reassurance. Environmental groups like the Everglades Foundation and Defenders of Wildlife began pushing for transparency, arguing that the public had a right to know the full scope of the experiment. Lawmakers in Tallahassee soon picked up the issue, with some calling for an emergency review and others defending the program as a necessary risk. The debate split the state down the middle. At the core of it all was one haunting question. Had Florida finally gone too far? The python threat was real, but now so was the fear that the cure might have opened a new kind of wound, one that could spread far beyond the swamps. What started as a bold scientific experiment had become a political and moral firestorm, and for the first time, the fight to save the Everglades felt like a battle no one could truly win. The ending was left hanging. Just when it seemed like science might finally tip the balance against the Burmese python, something unsettling began to happen. The Everglades, already fragile from decades of human impact, started shifting in ways no one fully predicted. At first, it looked like a success. Fewer snakes were being spotted in some areas. Nests that once produced dozens of hatchlings suddenly went quiet. Researchers celebrated, thinking the experiment had worked. But then, field teams noticed something strange. The snakes that remained were changing. They were harder to track, quicker to evade, and in some cases, surviving conditions that should have killed them. Tissue samples taken from captured snakes revealed traces of altered proteins, small mutations that suggested their bodies were adapting to resist the biological weapon meant to destroy them. It was the kind of shift scientists usually see over generations, not within a few breeding cycles. And that was not the only surprise. A few native snakes in nearby regions began showing similar markers, though none had been directly exposed to the experiment. That discovery left researchers with a terrifying question. Had the weapon somehow spread beyond its target species? The victory that once seemed within reach now felt like the beginning of something far more unpredictable. Florida had set out to control the invader. Instead, it may have helped it evolve. Thanks for watching. See you on the next one.